Flipped Chapter 4, The Sycamore Tree, pages 32 to 43. So now we are going to hear Giuliana's perspective about the sycamore tree. This is the chapter she is narrating. I love to watch my father paint, or really, I love to hear him talk while he paints. The words always come out soft and somehow heavy when he's brushing on the layers of a landscape. Not sad, weary maybe, but peaceful. My father doesn't have a studio or anything, and since the garage is stuffed with things that everyone thinks they need but no one ever uses, he paints outside. Outside is where the best landscapes are, and only there's nowhere near our house. So, what he does is keep a camera in his truck. His job as a mason takes him to lots of different locations, and he's always on the lookout for a great sunrise or sunset, or even just a nice field with sheep or cows. Then he picks out one of the snapshots, clips it to his easel, and paints. The paintings come out fine, but I've always felt a little sorry for him, having to paint beautiful scenes in our backyard, which is not exactly picturesque. It never was much of a yard, but after I started raising chickens, things didn't exactly improve. Dad doesn't seem to see the backyard or the chickens when he's painting, though. It's not just the snapshot or the canvas he sees either. It's something much bigger. He gets this look in his eye, like he's transcended the yard, the neighborhood, the world. And as his big calloused hands sweep a tiny brush against the canvas, it's almost like his body has been possessed by some grateful spiritual being. When I was little, my dad would let me sit beside him on the porch while he painted, and as long as I'd be quiet, I don't do quiet easily, but I discovered that about 5 or 10 minutes without a peep, he'd start talking. I've learned a lot about my dad that way. He told me all sorts of stories about what he'd done when he was my age, and other things too, like how he got his first job delivering hay, and how he wished he'd finished college. When I got a little older, he still talked about himself and his childhood, but he also started asking questions about me. What were we learning at school? What book was I currently reading? What did I think about this or that? So go ahead and type in the chat. What is Giuliana's relationship like with her dad? So how would you describe Giuliana's relationship with her dad so far? When I got a little older, he still talked. Sorry, I already read that part. Then, one time, he surprised me and asked me about Bryce. Why was I so crazy about Bryce? I told him about his eyes and his hair and the way his cheeks blush. But I don't think I explained it very well, because when I was done, Dad shook his head and told me in his soft, heavy words, that I needed to start looking at the whole landscape. I didn't really know what he meant by that, but it made me want to argue with him. How could he possibly understand about Bryce? He didn't know him. But this was not about an arguing spot. Those were scattered throughout the house, but not out here. We were both quiet for a record-breaking amount of time before he kissed me on the forehead and said, "Proper lighting is everything, Giuliana." So what do you think about Giuliana's dad's advice? Looking at the whole landscape. What did he mean by that? Go ahead and type in the chat. Proper lighting? What was that supposed to mean? I sat there wondering, but I was afraid that by asking, I'd be admitting that I wasn't mature enough to understand. And for some reason, it felt obvious, like I should understand. After that, he didn't talk so much about events as he did about ideas. And the older I got, the more philosophical he seemed to get. I don't know if he really got more philosophical or he just thought I could handle it now that I was in double digits. Mostly the things he talked about floated around me, but once in a while something would happen, and I would understand exactly what he meant. A painting is more than the sum of its parts, he would tell me, and then go on to explain how the cow by itself is just a cow, and the meadow by itself is just grass and flowers, and the sun peeking through the trees is just a beam of light. But pull them all together and you've got magic. I understood what he was saying, but I never felt what he was saying until one day when I was up in the sycamore tree. The sycamore tree had been at the top of the hill forever. It was on a big vacant lot, giving shade in the summer and a place for birds to nest in the spring. It had a built-in slide for us, too. Its trunk bent up and around in almost a complete spiral, and it was so much fun to ride down. My mom told me she thought the tree must have been damaged as a sapling, but survived. And now, maybe 100 years later, it was still there, the biggest tree she'd ever seen. A testimony to endurance is what she called it. I had always played in the tree, but I didn't become a serious climber until the 5th grade, when I went up to rescue a kite that was stuck in its branches. I'd first spotted the kite floating free through the air and then saw it dive bomb somewhere up the hill by the sycamore tree. I'd flown kites before, I know. Sometimes they're gone forever, and sometimes they're just waiting in the middle of the road for you to rescue them. Kites can be lucky, or they can be ornery. I've had both kinds, and a lucky kite is definitely worth chasing after. The kite looked lucky to me. It wasn't anything fancy, just an old-fashioned diamond with blue and yellow stripes. But it started along in a friendly way, and when it dive bombed, it seemed to do so from exhaustion as opposite to spike. Ornery kites dive bomb out of spite. They never get exhausted because they won't stay up long enough to poop out. 30 feet up, they just sort of smirk at you and crash for the fun of it. So Champ and I ran up to Collier Street, and after scouting out the road, Champ started barking at the sycamore tree. I looked up and spotted it too, flashing blue and yellow through the branches. It was a long ways up, but I thought I'd give it a shot. I shinnied up the tree, took a shortcut across the slide, and started climbing. Champ kept a good eye on me, barking me along, and as soon as I was higher than I'd ever been, but still the kite seemed forever away. Then below me, I noticed Bryce coming around the corner through the vacant lot, and I could tell from the way he was looking up that this was his kite. What a lucky, lucky kite this was turning out to be. "Can you climb that high?" he called up to me. "Sure," I called back, and up and up and up I went. The branches were strong, with just the right amount of intersections to make climbing easy, and the higher I got, the more amazed I was by the view. I'd never seen a view like that. It was like being in an airplane above all the rooftops, above the other trees, and above the world. Then I looked down at Bryce, and suddenly I got dizzy and weak in the knees. I was miles off the ground. Bryce shouted, "Can you reach it?" I caught my breath and managed to call down, "No problem," then forced myself to concentrate on those blue and yellow stripes, to focus on them, only them, as I shinnied up and up and up. Finally, I touched it. I grasped it. I had that kite in my hand. But the string was tangled in the branches above, and I couldn't seem to pull it free. Bryce called, "Break the string!" And somehow I managed to do just that. When I had the kite free, I needed a minute to rest, to recover before starting down. So instead of looking at the ground below me, I held on tight and looked up, out across the rooftops. That's when the fear of being up so high began to lift. And in its place came the most amazing feeling that I was flying, just soaring above the earth, sailing among the clouds. Then I began to notice how wonderful the breeze smelled. It smelled like sunshine and wild grass and pomegranates and rain. I couldn't stop breathing it in, filling my lungs again and again with the sweetest smell I'd ever known. Bryce called up, "Are you stuck?" Which brought me down to earth. Carefully, I backed up, prized stripes in my hand, and as I worked my way down, I could see Bryce circling the tree, watching me to make sure I was okay. By the time I hit the slide, That heady feeling I'd had in the tree was changing into the heady realization that Bryce and I were alone. Alone. My heart was positively racing as I held the kite out to him, but before he could take it, Champ nudged me from behind and I could feel his cold, wet nose against my skin. Against my skin. I grabbed my jeans in my back, and that's when I realized the seat of my pants were ripped wide open. Bryce laughed a little nervous laugh, so I could tell he knew. And for once, mine were the cheeks that were beet red. He took his kite and ran off, leaving me to inspect the damage. So now we heard Giuliana's point of view or perspective about the kite rescuing. How is Bryce's perspective different than Julia's? Or I should say, how is Julia's version of the story different than Bryce's version of the story? Think of one thing that's different and type in the chat. I did eventually get over the embarrassment of my jeans, but I never got over the view. I kept thinking of what it felt like to be so high up in that tree. I wanted to see it, to feel it again and again. It wasn't long before I wasn't afraid of being up so high and found the spot that became my spot. I could sit there for hours just looking out of the world. Sunsets were amazing. Some days they'd be purple and pink. Some days they'd be blazing orange, setting fire to clouds across the horizon. It was on a day like when my father's notion of what the whole being greater than the sum of its parts moved from my head to my heart. The view from my sycamore was more than rooftops and clouds and wind and colors combined. It was magic. And I started marveling at how I was feeling both humble and majestic. How was that possible? How could I be so full of peace and full of wonder? How could this simple tree make me feel so complex, so alive? So it seems like this tree is Giuliana's special place. Can anyone make a connection? Whether it's a tree, whether it's a fort, whether it's just a place that you love. Can you make a connection? Do you have a place where you feel like is your special place or where you feel it's magic? Go ahead and share in the chat publicly or privately. A place where you might feel alive and love. I went up the tree every chance I got. And in junior high, that became almost every day because the bus to our school picks up on Collier Street, right in front of the sycamore tree. At first, I just wanted to see how high I could get before the bus pulled up. But before long, I was leaving the house early so I could get a clear up to my spot to see the sunrise or the birds flutter about or just the other kids converge on the curb. I tried to convince the kids at the bus stop to climb up with me, even a little ways, but all of them said they didn't want to get dirty. Turn down a chance to feel magic for fear of a little dirt? I couldn't believe it. I never told my mother about climbing the tree. Being the truly sensible adult that she is, she would have told me it was too dangerous. My brothers, being brothers, wouldn't have cared. That left my father, the person I knew would understand. Still, I was afraid to tell him. He'd tell my mother, and pretty soon they'd insist that I stop. So I kept quiet, kept climbing, and felt a somewhat lonely joy as I looked out over the world. Then, a few months ago, I found myself talking to the tree. An entire conversation, just me and a tree. And on the climb down, I felt like crying. Why didn't I have someone real to talk to? Why didn't I have a friend like everyone else seemed to? Sure, there were kids I knew at school, but none of them were close friends. They'd have no interest in climbing the tree, in smelling the sunshine. That night after dinner, my father went outside to paint. In the cold of the night, under the glare of the porch light, he went out to put the finishing touches on a sunrise he'd been working on. I got my jacket and went out to sit beside him, quiet as a mouse. After a few minutes, he said, "What's on your mind, sweetheart?" And all the times I sat out there with him, he never asked me that. I looked at him but couldn't seem to speak. He mixed two hues of orange together and very softly he said, "Talk to me." I sighed so heavily it surprised even me. "I understand why you come out here, Dad." He tried kidding me. "Would you mind explaining it to your mother?" "Really, Dad, I understand about the whole being greater than the sum of the parts." He stopped mixing. "You do? What happened? Tell me about it." So I told him about the sycamore tree, and the views, and the sounds, and the colors, and the wind, and how being up so high felt like flying, felt like magic. He didn't interrupt me. And when my confession was through, I looked at him and whispered, "Would you climb up there with me?" He thought about this a long time, and then smiled and said, "I'm not much of a climber anymore, Giuliana, but I'll give it a shot, sure. How about this weekend, when we've got lots of daylight to work with?" Great. I went to bed so excited that I don't think I slept more than 5 minutes the whole night. Saturday was right around the corner, and I couldn't wait. The next morning, I raced to the bus stop, early, extra early, and climbed the tree. I caught the sun rising through the clouds, setting the streaks of fire from one end of the world to the other. And I was in the middle of making a mental list of all the things I was going to show my father when I heard a noise below. I looked down, and parked right beneath me were two trucks, big trucks. One of them was towing a long empty trailer, and the other was had a cherry picker on it, the kind they used to work on overhead power lines and telephone poles. There were four men standing around talking and drinking from thermoses, and I almost called down to them, "I'm sorry, but you can't park you there. That's a bus stop." But before I could, one of the men reached in the back of the truck and started unloading tools, gloves, ropes, a chain, earmuffs, and then chainsaws. 3 chainsaws. And still, I didn't get it. I kept looking around for what it was they could possibly be there to cut down. Then one of the kids who rides the bus showed up and started talking to them, and pretty soon he was pointing up at me. One of the men called, "Hey, you better come down from there. We got to take this thing down." I held on to the branch tight because suddenly it felt as though I might fall. I managed to choke out, "The tree?" "Yeah, now come on down." "But who told you to cut it down?" "The owner," he called back. "But why?" Even from 40 feet up, I could see him scowl. "Because he's going to build himself a house, and he can't very well do that with this tree in the way. Now come on, girl, we've got work to do." By the time most of the kids had gathered for the bus, they weren't saying anything to me, just looking up at me and turning from time to time to talk to each other. Then Bryce appeared, so I knew the bus was about to arrive. I searched across the rooftops, and sure enough, there it was, less than 4 blocks away. My heart was crazy with panic. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't leave and let them cut down the tree. I cried, "You can't cut it down. You just can't." So what would you do if you were Julie Baker? Would you stay up in that tree or would you get down? Go ahead and type in the chat. What would you do if you were Julie Baker? Put yourself in her shoes. By the time most of the kids had gathered for the bus, they weren't saying anything to me, just looking around and turning from time to time to talk to each other. Then Bryce appeared, so I knew the bus would arrive, and I searched across the rooftops, and sure enough, there it was less than 4 blocks away. Sorry, I already read this part, but I'm reading it again. My heart was crazy with panic. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't leave and let them cut the tree down. "You can't cut it down. You just can't." One of the men shook his head and said, "I am this close to calling the police. You are trespassing and obstructing progress of a contracted job. Now, are you going to come down or are we going to cut you down?" The bus was 3 blocks away. I'd never missed school for any reason other than legitimate illness, but I knew in my heart that I was going to miss my ride. "You're going to have to cut me down," I yelled. And then I had an idea. They'd never cut it down if all of us were in the tree. They'd have to listen. "Hey, guys," I called to my classmates. "Get up here with me. They can't cut it down if we're all up here. Marcia, Tony, Bryce, come on, you guys. Don't let them do this." They just stood there staring at me. I could see the bus 1 block away. "Come on, you guys. You don't have to come up this high, just a little ways. Please." The bus blasted up and pulled to the curb in front of the trucks, and when the doors folded open, one by one, my classmates climbed on board. What happened after that is a bit of a blur. I remember the neighbors gathering and the police with megaphones. I remember the fire brigade and some guys saying it was his blasted tree and I darn well better get out of it. Somebody tracked down my mother, who cried and pleaded and acted not at all the way a sensible mother should. But I was not coming down. I was not coming down. Then my father came racing up. He jumped out of the pickup truck, and after talking with my mother for a few minutes, he got the guy in the cherry picker to give him a lift up to where I was. After that, it was all over. I started crying and trying to get him to look out over the rooftops, but he wouldn't. He said that no view was worth his little girl's safety. He got me down and took me home. Only I couldn't stay there. I couldn't stand the sound of chainsaws in the distance. So Dad took me with him to work, and while he put up a block wall, I sat in the truck and cried. I must have cried for 2 straight weeks. Oh, sure, I went to school, and I functioned the best I could, but I didn't go there on the bus. I started riding my bike instead, taking the long way so I wouldn't have to go up Collier Street, up to the pile of sawdust that used to be the Earth's most magnificent sycamore tree. Then one evening, when I was locked up in my room, my father came in with something under a towel. I could tell it was a painting because that's how he transports the important ones. He shows them in the park. He sat down, resting the painting on the floor in front of him. "I always liked that tree of yours," he said, "even before you told me about it." "Oh, Dad, it's okay. I'll get over it." "No, Giuliana, no, you won't." I started crying. "It was just a tree." "I never want you to convince yourself of that. You and I both know it isn't true." "But Dad, bear with me a minute, would you?" He took a deep breath. "I want the spirit of that tree to be with you always. I want you to remember how you felt when you were up there." He hesitated a moment, then handed me the painting. "So I made this for you." I pulled off the towel, and there was my tree, my beautiful, majestic sycamore tree. Through the branches, he painted the fire of sunrise, and it seemed to me I would feel the wind. And way up in the tree was a tiny girl looking off in the distance, her cheeks flushed with wind, with joy, with magic. "Don't cry, Giuliana. I want to help you, not hurt you." I wiped the tears from my cheeks and gave a mighty sniff. "Thank you, Daddy," I choked. "Thank you." I hung the painting across the room from my bed. It's the first thing I see every morning and the last thing I see every night. And now that I can look at it without crying, I see more than a tree and what being up in its branches meant to me. I see the day that my view of things around me started changing.